The snow was relentless, thick flakes swirling around me in an endless, blinding dance. I'd known the risks of solo climbing, of heading out this deep into the wilderness alone, but I was confident, stubborn. I'd done this before. But now, as night crept in and the sky turned a dark, bruised shade of purple, doubt began to gnaw at me. Somewhere along the climb, the landscape had blurred into a featureless, frozen wasteland. I'd lost my way, and with every passing minute, the cold seemed to press down harder, sinking into my bones. Panic fluttered in my chest as I stumbled forward, my legs heavy, my breath turning to ice in my lungs. I knew the stories, hikers and climbers disappearing, swallowed by the mountain as if they never existed at all. And then, out of the white, I saw it, an old radio tower, barely visible against the blizzard's haze. A red light blinked at the top, slow and dim, casting an eerie glow that pulsed faintly through the falling snow. Relief surged through me. It was shelter. It was a chance. I staggered toward it, my boots crunching through snow and ice, until I finally reached the rusted ladder at its base. With frozen hands, I began to climb, my gloved fingers slipping on the icy rungs. Each step up felt like a mile, but the dim red light at the top urged me on, like a lighthouse in a storm. When I reached the small, enclosed platform at the top, I found a tiny, dilapidated room, barely large enough to sit in, with a single ancient radio transmitter resting on a metal table. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, dust covering the dials and wires. But when I switched it on, it crackled to life, the static hissing and popping like a thing alive. Relief filled me, warming me more than any fire could. I took a deep breath, leaning close to the microphone. This is Alex Lawson. I'm lost on the northern ridge near the old tower. If anyone can hear me, please, I need help. The static hummed in response, blanketing the silence. Then, just as I was about to try again, the static broke, and a voice crackled through, soft and weak. Help me, it whispered. I froze. It wasn't just any voice. It was my voice, faint and distorted, but unmistakable. My own words echoing back to me as though trapped in the static. Help me! I'm lost, please! A shiver crawled down my spine. I listened, transfixed, as the message repeated, my own voice pleading over and over, growing weaker with each repetition, like an echo bouncing through endless corridors. I leaned closer, heart pounding, gripping the radio with shaking hands. Hello? Is anyone there? Silence. Then the voice returned, clearer this time, more desperate. Help me! I'm cold. I can't get out. The words were exactly what I'd been thinking moments earlier, but I hadn't spoken them. They weren't just words, they were my thoughts, broadcast back to me, somehow twisted, warped by the static. A sudden dread clawed at me, irrational but overwhelming. I wanted to turn the radio off, to climb down and run as far as I could, but something held me there, as if the voice itself had anchored me. Then, the voice shifted, becoming low, guttural, something I barely recognized as my own. It was deeper, filled with a malice that raised every hair on my neck. You shouldn't have come here. It rasped, each word like a sliver of ice pressing into my skull. This place is not meant for the living. I backed away, nearly tripping over the small metal chair behind me. My mind raced, grasping for any explanation, a trick of the cold, an echo in the atmosphere, some strange phenomenon. But deep down, I knew none of that was true. The voice on the radio chuckled, a low, mocking sound that crawled under my skin. You'll never leave, it said with a certainty that made my blood run cold. We're waiting. Suddenly, the red light above me flickered, casting the room in brief, jagged shadows. And then I saw something, a reflection in the frosty window next to me. I turned slowly, unwillingly, my body numb with horror. There, standing just behind me, was me? Or something that looked like me, its features twisted and pale, its eyes hollow and dark as pits. It grinned, a smile that stretched too far, its teeth too sharp, gleaming in the dim light. I stumbled back, but it mirrored me, moving as I moved, its expression mocking. I shut my eyes, trying to force myself to believe it wasn't real. I was just tired, I told myself. The cold was playing tricks on me. But when I opened my eyes again, it was still there, watching, its dark eyes widening with amusement. "Help me!" It mouthed, the words silent but somehow echoing in my mind. "Stay." The radio crackled, and my voice came through once more, pleading, desperate, sounding as though it was slipping further away with each repetition. The static hissed, but underneath, I could hear other voices now, dozens of them, a chorus of lost souls all whispering the same words. "Help me! Help me!" I turned to the radio, desperate to turn it off, to make it stop. But as I reached for the dial, a cold hand closed over mine, stopping me. I looked down, and there it was again, my own hand, pale and dead, gripping mine like a vice, holding me in place. The other me leaned in, its hollow eyes gleaming with a terrible knowledge. "You don't get to leave, Alex," it whispered, its voice blending with the static. "You're part of us now." I yanked my hand back, stumbling out onto the narrow platform, gasping for air. The snow was thicker now, swirling around me in a blinding storm. I wanted to climb down, to escape, but something stopped me. I looked down and realized with horror that my own footprints had vanished. There was no sign of how I'd arrived, no trail leading back to safety. And then, as I looked around in growing terror, I saw figures emerging from the snow. Shadows, faint at first but growing clearer, each one watching me with dark, empty eyes. They were all around the tower, dozens of them, their forms shifting and blending into the blizzard. And they all looked like me. I stumbled back inside, my heart pounding, and grabbed the radio, my last hope. But as I switched it on, the static hummed, filling the air, and my own voice came through, weak, almost fading. "Help me!" I whispered, my voice thin and hopeless, echoing back at me from the radio, looping endlessly as if already resigned to its fate. I screamed into the microphone, calling for anyone, for anything to hear me. But all I heard in response was my own voice, calling back from some distant, unreachable place, begging, pleading. The last thing I remember before the light in the radio room flickered out completely was that other me, leaning close, smiling with a sickening familiarity. "Welcome home," it whispered, just as the static swallowed me whole. "And now, when the snow falls thick and the night settles over the mountain, if you find that old tower and listen carefully to the radio, you might hear my voice, whispering, trapped in an endless loop. Just one more soul, lost in the snow. Help me." We were looking for adventure, a night away from the buzz and glow of the city. Just a camping trip, the kind where you laugh too loud around a fire, tell a few ghost stories, and feel a thrill from the mere fact that you're far from civilization. But the place we chose wasn't just any forest. It was deep, remote, and unnervingly quiet, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. It was supposed to be a joke when Jason found the cabin. He sprinted through the trees, waving us over, his face lit up with excitement, half mad from lack of sleep and the thrill of stumbling upon something unexpected. We'd been hiking for hours, and our tents were heavy, our bags even heavier, so we followed him eagerly, thinking we'd found an easy place to set up camp. When we saw the cabin, though, my heart sank. There was something wrong about it. It crouched in a dense thicket, leaning to one side, like it had grown tired of itself. The wood was dark with rot, the roof patched with leaves and branches as if nature was trying to reclaim it. The air around it was thick, almost swampy, and the smell of damp earth lingered, clinging to us like a shroud. "Creepy as hell," Sarah murmured, but she couldn't hide her curiosity any more than the rest of us. Jason pushed open the door, the hinges shrieking like a dying animal, and we all filed in. The floorboards groaned underfoot, and the walls were marked with strange, twisting carvings, almost like symbols, etched deep into the wood. There were crude, eerie dolls hanging from the ceiling and leaning against the corners. They were made of sticks, bound with bits of cloth and string, like faceless scarecrows that hadn't grown up right. The air was thick and musty, stinging my eyes and nose. "Look at these things," Maria whispered, pointing to one of the dolls. Its head was nothing more than a misshapen clump of fabric, eyes drawn in dark, charcoal smudges. We drifted from room to room, poking around, murmuring nervously to each other, trying to keep the mood light. But then we found the mirror. It was in the last room, shoved into a corner as if someone had tried to hide it. Dust covered its surface, thick enough to obscure any reflection, and something about it made me hesitate. "Should we really be here?" I asked, but Jason just laughed, brushing my concern away. "Oh, come on, it's just an old mirror," he said, reaching out and wiping away the dust. As he swiped his hand across the glass, I saw the words appear, scrawled in jagged letters as if carved from within. "Welcome home." We all froze, staring at the words. No one spoke. We just watched the mirror, half expecting the letters to move or shift, to disappear like a trick of the light. Then we heard it. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere above us. Heavy enough to make the ceiling creak and groan. Each step felt like it vibrated through the walls, through my bones. "Bud, there's no upstairs," Maria whispered, her face pale. She was right. We'd seen the cabin from every angle, and there was no second floor, no loft. Just a roof with dark, rotting beams. Jason tried to laugh it off, to say it was probably just the house settling, but his voice shook, and none of us believed him. Without a word, we bolted for the door, stumbling out into the cold night air, gasping, shoving each other in our panic to get out. Outside, I glanced back at the cabin, only to freeze in horror. Dark figures stood in every window, unmoving, watching us. I couldn't make out their faces, but their outlines were solid, real. And they were waiting, as if expecting us to come back inside. "We need to go," I said, grabbing Maria's arm, but she was staring at the cabin, her face slack, almost entranced. Who are they?" she whispered, and that's when I felt it, something cold and heavy pressing down on my chest, a feeling of dread so powerful that it threatened to pull me to my knees. Just then, Jason's flashlight flickered. He swore, hitting it against his leg, but the light wouldn't hold, leaving us in near darkness. The figures in the windows remained still, but I could sense something shifting, a quiet rustling, like fabric brushing against fabric. "They're coming out," I whispered, barely able to speak. We turned and started running, back into the forest, back to the familiar trail, but the trees seemed to close in around us, as if the forest itself was alive, guiding us back toward the cabin. No matter how far we ran, we would glance over our shoulders and see it, the cabin, impossibly close, its windows glowing faintly with the figures still watching. Then Sarah screamed, and when I turned I saw why. Hanging from the branches around us were more of those dolls, swaying gently, like they were watching us too, waiting, observing. They hadn't been there before. And now, each one bore a face, rough, crude, drawn with what looked like charcoal. They wore our faces. "This isn't real," Jason muttered, clutching his head. "This isn't real." We kept moving, trying to find a way out, to escape the looming presence of the cabin that seemed to pulse with every beat of my heart. The forest felt like a maze, twisting and shifting, and soon, I lost all sense of direction. I was stumbling blindly, separated from the others, branches clawing at my arms and face. Finally, I tripped and fell hard, and when I looked up, I found myself lying in front of the cabin's door. A shadow moved in the window, and I heard my own voice whisper from within. "Welcome home." I scrambled back, but something caught my ankle, yanking me toward the cabin. I looked down, horrified, to see roots curling up from the ground, wrapping around my legs, pulling me in. I tried to scream, but the forest swallowed the sound. And then, just as quickly, the forest was silent. The roots released me, and the cabin door swung shut. My friends were gone. The trees stood silent around me, their twisted branches motionless. In the dawn light, I stumbled back to the trailhead alone. There was no cabin behind me, no dolls hanging from the trees. Just an empty forest, still and serene. I tried to tell myself it had been a nightmare, that the whole thing had been some terrible hallucination. But when I reached into my pocket, my hand closed around a small doll made of sticks and cloth, its eyes smudged with charcoal. And on its face, drawn in rough, dark lines, was my own face, eyes wide with terror, mouth open in a silent scream. The others were never found. And every so often, I find myself drawn back to that forest, to the place where we found the cabin. At night, when I close my eyes, I see their faces in the windows, waiting, watching. And sometimes, I hear them calling me home. The sun had barely broken over the horizon when I started my hike, but even with the early light, the field stretched before me in a gray, endless expanse. The ground was an ocean of brittle, dry grass that crackled beneath my boots, whispering faintly with every step. I pushed on, keeping my eyes fixed on the distant line of trees miles away. The silence of the place was thick, almost suffocating, but it was peaceful. For a while, a whisper drifted by, barely audible, just a faint murmur against the morning breeze. I stopped and tilted my head, listening, but heard nothing more. Just the soft sigh of the wind threading through the tall grass. I chuckled to myself, shaking off a prickling unease. The mind plays tricks in desolate places like this, I reminded myself, and I walked on. But as the day wore on, the whispers didn't stop. They grew more frequent, and soon I could hear words. It was still faint, still caught in the undertones of the wind, but it was there. A chorus of low voices. Pleading. Desperate. Help us. Each step felt heavier, as if the earth were pulling me down. I wanted to believe it was fatigue, that the whispers were just echoes of my own breath, my own weariness. But that didn't explain the chill that clung to my skin, wrapping around my ankles, climbing slowly like icy tendrils. I glanced down, almost afraid of what I might see, but there was nothing unusual. Just grass, wavering in the breeze. And then I noticed them, faint impressions in the grass at my feet, as if someone had walked here before me. The steps seemed strange, irregular, but they clearly formed a pattern. I squinted, heart thudding as I traced them, my breath catching when I realized what they spelled. Don't leave me. I took a stumbling step back, eyes darting around the empty field. Nothing moved except the grass, swaying gently as if undisturbed. The whispers grew louder, rising like an invisible tide, wrapping around me, pressing in. A woman's voice, soft and broken, whispered my name. It was a whisper no longer carried on the wind. It was inside me, vibrating against my bones, a whisper that scratched and pulled at something deep in my chest. Who's there? I called, my voice too loud, cracking the silence like a whip. There was no answer. Just more whispering, a jumble of voices now, all blending together, growing louder, closer, until I could barely make out individual words. Don't leave me, please! A hand, cold, like ice, brushed against my ankle. I gasped, jerking away, but the sensation clung to me, lingering, trailing up my leg. I looked down again and froze. There, in the grass, were new impressions. Footsteps. Hundreds of them, leading from all directions, converging on me. They weren't just footsteps. They were shapes, forms, bodies outlined in the brittle grass, pressing toward me. Ghostly hands reaching out, the grass bending beneath invisible weight, their fingers stretching out, begging. Panicked, I turned and started to run. My boots sank into the earth as if the ground were trying to hold me back, to swallow me whole. The voices followed, now more than whispers. They were cries, a wail that filled the air, my name clawing through the endless field. Stop! They screamed. Don't go! I risked a glance over my shoulder, and my blood turned to ice. The field was no longer empty. Figures, dark and hollow-eyed, filled the space behind me, drifting shadows that moved through the grass like smoke. I could barely make out their faces, blurred and shifting, but their mouths were wide open, screaming my name, pleading, accusing. My legs burned as I pushed forward, but every step felt harder, as if the earth itself had turned to tar. My breath came in gasps, and when I looked down, I saw my footprints sinking deep into the ground. For a horrible second, I thought I would be pulled down, but I fought on, desperate, terrified, running from those ghostly hands that reached, grasping, clutching at the air. The shadows were everywhere now, closing in, hemming me in like a tide. I stumbled, falling to my knees, and felt the cold brush of a hand on my shoulder. I didn't dare look back. The voices grew louder, angrier. "You can't leave us! Not again! Not after what you did! What I did!" The words cut through my fear, leaving confusion in its wake. I tried to push myself up, but another hand settled on my arm, then another, and another. I was surrounded, trapped, as ghostly fingers gripped my arms, my legs, pressing me down. A woman's face, hollow and gray, leaned close, her eyes filled with empty longing, her mouth whispering words I couldn't bear to understand. "You left us here," she murmured. "All of us, you left us." A memory, hazy and half-formed, flickered at the edge of my mind. This field, this endless sea of grass. I had been here before. Years ago. A night filled with shadows, a place I'd come to forget, no, to leave behind. But I hadn't been alone. I had walked away, leaving someone behind, leaving them all behind. "Please," I gasped, trying to shake free. "I don't remember. I don't remember any of you." But the voices grew more insistent, each one tugging at my memory, dredging up images I had buried. Figures half seen in darkness, faces twisted with fear, eyes empty and accusing. I had left them here, abandoned them to this cursed field, and now they were here to claim me. The shadows pressed closer, their hollow faces merging into one, their hands dragging me down, down into the earth. I felt myself sinking, the ground parting beneath me as they pulled, the grass swallowing me up. The sun faded above, the world narrowing to a pinpoint of light, and still, the voices surrounded me, filling my ears, my mind, my very soul. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything was silent. The field was empty once more, stretching on forever, lifeless and still. No one saw the small, brittle patch of grass where I had vanished. And now, on certain days when the wind is just right, if you walk through that field, you might hear the faintest whisper, a voice carried on the breeze, pleading, desperate. "Don't leave me!